Hey everybody, welcome to week 3. This week we're covering ideologies and identities that act as foundations to American politics and philosophies. And we also got our special guest right behind me, good old Mo Burger. All right, let's get going. So today's learning objectives generally, we're going to look at John Locke and a lot of his primary and foundational contributions to political theory, which acted as a foundation for a lot of the beliefs of our founding fathers. We're going to look at some aspects of his work consisting of the state of nature and the social contract, both very important to understand for the quizzes coming up in this class. We're also going to understand the difference between totalitarianism, authoritarianism, tyranny, anarchy, liberty. We're going to identify the differences in definitions behind liberalism and conservatism, libertarianism. We're going to also look at some economic political theories regarding socialism, capitalism, and communism. So this is a very definition heavy week. It is important to remember all these terms. I will be honest with you, I will not be quizzing you on the definitions of socialism, capitalism, communism, while every single other term we cover in today's lecture will be important for upcoming quizzes. All right, so let's get going. So right off the bat, I want to talk about John Locke, one of the most important political theorists regarding early American history. We see his most famous work, Two Treatises of Government. If you were in my political theory course, we would be covering this text in detail. What he says regarding the state, religion, individual rights, all of these essential and very important concepts in political theory. But the scope we're going to take in our courses, we're going to focus on his writing regarding the state of nature, which is, as we define it, a state in which there is no government. Think of society in the caveman days. Think before politics became an essential part of life, before there was true authority in your lives. We're also going to look at this concept and a lot of us are familiar with the concept of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Well, its origins is John Locke, where he says, instead of the pursuit of happiness, he says life, liberty, and property, a foundational aspect of his work. We will not dive into property as much in this week's lecture as we will in my political theory course, which I encourage you all to take because it's more fun and it's in person. So I get to yell at you in person, which is always more fun. But the general focus of John Locke's text is individual liberties, universal and natural rights, which are, the right are universal rights that are granted to every individual in every society, which we'll dive into in more detail later, which acts as a foundation for the inspiration for our Bill of Rights, among other aspects of our government. So it's important to remember John Locke, how he has contributed to American politics, a little bit of, and we'll cover that again in just a second, but a little bit of overview on his personal life. He was 10 years old during the English Civil War. And if you really think about experiencing a civil war in your youth, that's the ideal time to view this with some optimism. You see a civil war, you see a period of revolutionary change, you see an opportunity for yourself to engage. And when you think of it that way, you can see the foundations and understand his concepts more deeply, the foundations to his political theories. His father fought in the Parliamentary Army. He also studied medicine later on in life at Oxford, a college you all should be somewhat familiar with. He got his early start working in political theory as he was hired to work alongside the Earl of Shaftesbury at Oxford. And this is where he worked on a lot of his political theories. A quote from his work I will read to you real quick, I think is very important. Quote, man being born, as has been proved, with a title to perfect freedom and an uncontrolled enjoyment of all the rights and privileges of the laws of nature, equally with any other man or numbers of men in the world, hath by nature a power, not only to preserve his property, that is his life, liberty, and estate, against the injuries and attempts of other men. And that is the quote where we see life, liberty, and property surfacing in his sentiments. He is referred to throughout political theorists as a social contract theorist, which we will dive into a little bit later on. He influenced a lot of the authors of our Declaration of Independence, Constitution, Bill of Rights, and set forth a natural law argument based not upon divine right or divine law or rights granted by the gods, but rather the capacity to reason on the basis of equality. So he said he has a new view of government. Government and authority stems from the people, not a greater authority in God. So let's rewind a bit. Let's talk about the state of nature. The state of nature is, this is the most important part of this slide, the condition of all people before there was a state or civil society. Again, think of it like the caveman days, before there was a system of authority, before there was government. This is where all humans have the right to do whatever is necessary to survive. There are no obligations to other people. And depending on who you see writing about this time period, this concept, it is either a state of perpetual war, if you're reading the works of Thomas Hobbes, or a state of absolute equality, if you're reading the works of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. But John Locke has a somewhat middle of the road, but more optimistic viewpoint on the state of nature. That the state of nature is a state in which we have the opportunity for equality, although there will always be someone to challenge our properties. And then this is where we get into the concept of why we create a state. We'll go into that in the next slide. Let me take a break there for a second. But I do want to address there are two laws in this state of nature, in society, before we have a system of government. The first law, it's pretty, and these are both very common sense laws. The first one is that we all desire peace. That is the common goal that every human being has, that we want peace in our personal lives. And the second law of the state of nature is, in order for us to obtain that peace that we all objectively desire, we must forfeit certain rights in order to have the protection of all other rights. For example, you forfeit your right to pillage and steal for the protection of your property from others within your local domain. So it is the forfeiting of certain rights that are obtainable and present in the state of nature when there is no authority. You allow for an authority in order for that authority to govern your life and protect the dimensions of your life that you need safe. So there is a concept, if you take my theory course, we cover called tabula rasa. This is a foundation of John Locke's text, and tabula rasa really just means we are all born with a blank slate. And you can see this in his concepts. Our experiences formulate who we are in society and what laws we need to have to protect ourselves. So the main summary of this slide is that the state of nature is the condition of all people before there was a state or civil society or any system of government. And John Locke uses this concept, this thought experiment, to illustrate natural rights, the rights that are granted to all humans regardless of the society you live in, and the role of the state, which we'll dive into in the next slide. So, the social contract. This is defined as an exchange of certain rights for the protection of all other rights. This is basically the second law of nature. This is what happens in this in the state of nature. We see that we need to we desire peace, and in order to obtain that peace, we need to forfeit certain rights, exchange certain rights for the protections of all others. So we enter into a social contract. This is where we begin formulating a state. This state is aimed to protect our expansive list of rights as we have forfeited a select few to become a part of this state. This is and again, the only takeaway we need to focus on in today's lecture is being able to define the social contract and the state of nature. State of nature, society before government. The social contract is the exchange of rights in order for the protection of others, which can also be viewed as the transition, the agreement we make as we enter into a state. We also see, if you looked into this content in my political theory course, John Locke holds a long discussion regarding private property in regards to the social contract. That private property comes before the social contract. We have land and we want to protect it. And in order to protect our land or our properties, we sign into the social contract. There's a quote from Locke's work: "For no government can have a right to obedience from a people who have not freely consented to it." My video is cutting that off, but I remember it, who have not. So it is very important to remember the definition of the state of nature and the social contract, and that they act as the foundational thought experiment for John Locke's philosophies, which immensely inspired our founding fathers. So I want to focus on three primary results that we have because of the work of the writings of John Locke and how our founding fathers interpreted it. So one one result in American government is that we have a heavy focus on individual liberties. That is the foundation that guides the entirety of our Bill of Rights. And if you look further into our Bill of Rights, we can see the Second Amendment stemming from Locke's text, Locke's writings regarding a tyrannical government. And I want to read this quote from John Locke's text regarding tyrannical governments. He says, quote, "The end of government is the good of mankind, and which is best for mankind, that the people should be always exposed to the boundless will of tyranny, or that the rulers should be sometimes liable to be opposed, when they grow exorbitant in the use of their power, and employ it for their destruction, and not the preservation of the properties of their people." So we see, end quote. And so we see within that text that the rulers sometimes must be liable for their actions. This is emphasizing that when rulers become tyrannical, when we have a system that becomes a tyrannical government, and we will cover the definition of tyranny in just a few slides. But when we have a tyrannical government, the people have the right and responsibility to hold their rulers accountable. Now, we have to also understand the concept of tyranny was very different at this time when John Locke was writing this text compared to today, which we'll cover in just a few slides. But there is also another contribution John Locke has to American government. That is his emphasis on religious tolerance. We would not, there was an argument that we would not have the religious tolerance present in our current government if it weren't for the writings of John Locke. We see within his 2 treatises of government, he provides 3 reasons why we must have religious tolerance. I will not go into those reasonings today, but if you're curious for your paper or just personal life what those reasonings were, I'd be happy to discuss them over Zoom or email, so please just reach out. But the takeaway from this slide is 3 primary contributions of John Locke are that we have a heavy focus on individual rights present within the Bill of Rights. We have an amendment regarding the responsibility of individuals in response to a tyrannical government, and that is number 2. And number 3 is our emphasis on religious tolerance. So let's get some definitions down. That's what the rest of this lecture is going to be. I want to make sure we have the foundations to continue on in this course, and here we're going to provide those foundations. So liberty, what is liberty? This concept that we have talked about so much in American politics and in this lecture today. So liberty is the greatest freedom of the individual that is consistent with the freedom of other individuals within the society. I like to rephrase every definition in my own words to show and make sure that I completely understand it, and I hope you do the same. When I rephrase this definition, I say liberty is the ability for you to be and do whatever you want to be and do. But wait, there's a caveat, because you can only be and do whatever you want to be and do up until the point where you impede your neighbor from being able to be and do whatever they desire to be and do. And I know that was mightily wordy, but please try and rephrase these concepts in your own language to make sure you understand them on a deeper level. You have the right to do whatever you want up until that action impedes your neighbor's ability to do whatever they want. So liberty, we see numerous guarantees of liberty in our Bill of Rights and a lot of our founding documents. We also see throughout American and U.S. history this conflict between liberty and order and liberty and equality. We look at our textbook, the page numbers I provided, dives into this conflict throughout U.S. history in more detail. So if you want to look at this conflict through our textbook where I got this information, of course for this lecture, not generally, but please look into those pages. But to summarize this generally, the conflict between liberty versus order is exemplified in moments like Japanese internment camps during World War II, or the Patriot Act after 9/11. These are restrictions of our privacy or individuality in order to provide security or order for the general population. Think about Japanese internment camps during World War II. We were at war against Japan, and we created Japanese internment camps in which we kept Japanese Americans in these collectives to ensure order, although previously they did not present a significant threat. We also see a restriction of our liberties in response to the 9/11 attacks, as we saw the Patriot Act, in which we greatly expanded our our ability to listen in on various transmissions. And we see that this conflict continues on in numerous points throughout U.S. history. Liberty, or right to be whatever we want to be, and the need for structure, order, and security, which often comes with the restriction of various liberties. We also see the fight between liberty versus equality represented through our struggle for voting rights in the US, also represented in the struggle for gay marriage rights. Our textbook goes into more detail on that. If you are curious, I encourage you to please visit. But the main takeaway from this slide, once again, is the definition of liberty, which is the greatest freedom of the individual, consistent with the freedom of other individuals within the same society. Now, here we need to cover two contrasting terms. These two terms stand on opposite ends of a single spectrum. The terms are tyranny on one side and anarchy on the other. Tyranny is an excessively cruel and oppressive government or rule. This is a system in which you have your everyday life dictated in excess by a central government authority. Anarchy, it stands on the exact opposite end of that spectrum. Anarchy is the complete absence of government. Think of anarchy present in the viewpoints and negative viewpoints of the state of nature. Remember, state of nature is a society where there is no established government, there is no civil society, no structured order, and you just have mayhem. You have anarchy. That is a state of nature. If Thomas Hobbes would identify the state of nature as a state of pure anarchy, well, John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau would have a slight disagreement from that. And then we see our textbook makes an interesting argument that I think is worth the discussion, that the absence of leadership in a state of anarchy is not possible. And instead, in systems where there is anarchy, we see leadership and power concentrated in the hands of small militant groups that are, quote from the textbook, indistinguishable from gangsters. I find that just very fascinating. Again, page 7 in our textbooks if you want to look into that discussion further. But the primary takeaway, once again, from this slide is the definition of anarchy and the definition of tyranny. We see that these fears resulted in the formation of the first political parties as well, if you remember from last week's lecture. We see that the Federalists were fearful of anarchy. They were fearful of mob rule and simple, excessive democracy when oversimplified. And the Democratic Republicans were very fearful of having another tyrannical government, especially since we just rebelled against a tyrannical government in the eyes of those constituents. So fears of these ideologies contributed to the formation of the first political party system in the US. And again, repeat, anarchy is the absence of government. Tyranny is the excessive presence of government, cruel and oppressive government or rule. Now, populism, a very important term that we have heard in recent years. Populism, defined, involves the appeals to the interests and concerns of ordinary people against elite or establishment interests. Now, it is worth noting, populism is present within both political parties and has been for generations. Contemporary examples of populism consist of Bernie Sanders' appeals to expanding access to expanding access to healthcare, and Donald Trump in his many drain the swamp sentiments, and you see various sentiments regarding populist appeal. They don't have your interest in mind. They are appealing to the elites. Now I will come in and protect you from these elite interests. You see populist sentiments increasing. Some studies have revealed that they increase when we have economic inequalities present. And that is a discussion for another day. If you would like to look into this further or just have a discussion about populism and its relationship to economic inequalities, I would love to have that over Zoom or via email. But I want to focus on the definition of populism here because that is what we're going to take away from today's lecture. Populism, the appeal to the interests and concerns of ordinary people against elite or establishment interests. Now, another term, nationalism, emphasizes the interest and identity of a nation as a whole, often including a strong focus on protecting national borders, culture, and identity, sometimes even at the detriment of other nations. Nationalism prioritizing the state you live in over others. This instills unity in a nation and oftentimes is viewed as essential to having unity and preventing secession of states or regions. This can also help mobilize individuals during national crises. Nationalism was a unifying factor after the attacks on 9/11. Now you see various texts will make the argument between the conflict, the argument focusing on the conflict between patriotism and nationalism. And when does patriotism become nationalism? Patriotism also the love of country, the love of your nation, the protection and building up of that nation. So we see that there are some detriments and some benefits to nationalism. Benefits, it unifies the nation. It instills unity, it helps mobilize in crisis, while there are the detriments that it can lead to events like the internment of Japanese Americans after World War II or McCarthyism in the 1950s, as we had such a populist appeal against communist sentiments, often at the detriment of our own liberties as individuals. And we saw various individuals being blacklisted within numerous industries, resulting in a fear of this sentiment. So nationalism, oftentimes good to unify populations, can also create division against outside or perceived outside enemies. But again, the takeaway from this slide, nationalism emphasizes the interest and identity of a nation as a whole, often including a strong focus on protecting borders, culture, and identity, sometimes even at the detriment of other nations. So this is where we get a little bit into the weeds, and it is very important for us all to understand these next two definitions clearly, liberalism and conservatism. And I will happily have any discussion regarding these terms via email or over Zoom, but here I want to provide a short and simple definition and conversation. So liberalism, defined in this class as an ideology which fosters progressive ideas centered around individual rights, equality, social justice, and most importantly, a strong role for the central government in addressing societal issues. Now you see this ideology primarily present within the members of the Democratic Party. They often have a focus on social contract theory that some rights must be forfeited for the protection of other rights. This often justifies government intervention into our lives in order to protect minority interests when there are majorities. This is social contract theory, I do want to emphasize, is not exclusively connected to liberalism. We see discussions of this by early liberal thinker John Locke, although he does not represent liberalism in the contemporary American definition that we have provided here. We also see this social contract theory present in the work of Edmund Burke, who we will see as the father of contemporary conservatism in the next slide. So I want to repeat, the definition of liberalism is an ideology which fosters progressive ideas centered around individual rights, equality, social justice, and a strong role for government in addressing societal issues. The primary factor that we're focusing on in this course is the last point, a strong role for the central government in addressing societal issues. Our government needs to ensure protections for minority rights whenever possible. And we see that that is our primary takeaway from this slide, the definition of liberalism. And continuing on, we are here to now define conservatism as the ideology which emphasizes limited government intervention, traditional values and institutions, free market capitalism, and individual liberties. This is, of course, primarily present in members of the Republican Party, and we see Edmund Burke acting as the first conservative, and the foundations of his belief emphasize the value of tradition and gradual change. Tradition and gradual change is founded off the idea that we have inherited the institutions that we have around us from previous generations. Think of it very simply. Did you or your parents build the highways we drive on? It is more likely to be your ancestors beyond that, your grandparents, your great-grandparents, your great-great-great-grandparents. These are the individuals we have inherited our roads and institutions from. We need to keep in mind the progress of past generations as we build upon these institutions. And we do not, sentiments within the conservative ideology is that we need gradual change before revolutionary change, because revolutionary change discredits the progress of past generations. So, in conclusion, we remember from this slide, our primary takeaway is that conservatism is the ideology which emphasizes limited government intervention, traditional values and institutions, maintaining those traditional values and institutions, free market capitalism, and individual liberties. We also see another important term, libertarianism. Libertarianism is an ideology that believes in minimal state intervention in the free market and the private lives of citizens. Conservatism maintains a general sentiment that we need to have limited government intervention, but libertarianism takes it a step further. We see David Hume, Adam Smith, Thomas Jefferson, and Thomas Paine representing a lot of dimensions of this ideology, and they focus on a pure absence of state intervention in the market and in our social lives. We see John Locke often representing this libertarian perspective. John Locke represents a lot of the liberal views as well as libertarian views. As we can see, a formula for inspiring many of our founding fathers. So foundations of liberalism include individualism and individual rights. Only individuals make choices and are responsible for their actions. Remember, individual rights, life, liberty, and property, are rights that are inherited to every single living human, like the sovereign rights of the individual. They also discuss spontaneous order, which is basically the sources of order do not originate from a central authority, but instead naturally, as millions of individuals engage in society. We see the social contract instills order through this process. And rule of law, we see a limited government, free market. A lot of these foundations are represented in views that would surprise many of you. And we'll go into that in just a second when we talk about socialism, capitalism, and communism. So, capitalism. And I want to repeat the next three terms I will not be quizzing you on, but it is important to get a foundational view of these terms before we move on in this course. As we in the United States have a mixed economy, a mixed version of these three sentiments, capitalism, socialism, and communism are all present. Well, I would argue communism is not present in the United States, because we will look at the definition in a second. But the US is a mixed economy. So, capitalism is an economic and political system in which a country's trade and industry are controlled by private owners for profit rather than by the state. So, capitalism, you have the ability to own everything for your own personal goals, for profit. We do not have, in a pure capitalist society, any government ownership over public goods. So this is present in all Western democracies. We even see dimensions of capitalism in the state that identifies as communism, Communist China. Under their one-party rule, we see that their citizens are able to own property, own houses. That is a dimension of capitalism. So we see political economy internationally is a lot more nuanced than we may think right off the top of our minds. So within a capitalist society, we need competition. High competition is what lowers prices. Think of it this way. Say you have a store that sells gas, and you're the only store that sells gas in a 10-mile radius. You have the ability to make the prices whatever you want, because there are people that cannot drive that extra 10 miles to get their gasoline. But if you have a competitor right across the street, there is often what would happen where you would have competition for the lowest price and the general market. So you would consistently lower prices, and you would have to sell at a lower price because of your competitor across the street. So we see capitalism advocated by one of the great political theorists, Adam Smith. This is in his work, The Wealth of Nations. This is where he defends the idea of laissez-faire capitalism. Remember that term, laissez-faire, present within the Democratic Republicans, representative of the southern states. Laissez-faire, a hands-free economy. A laissez-faire capitalism economy is a type of economic system in which transactions between private groups of people are free from any form of economic interventionism. So any trading, any market actions are free of any intervention. Uh, Opponents to capitalism will often cite this term called late stage capitalism. This is where competition is decreasing due to the gradual monopolization of markets. So you see how um, online retailers, you go back a set amount of years, you would see eBay and all these others. Now you fast forward and you see a extreme dominance of Amazon. Although there are other online retailers, every store has their online retail shopping. Clothing is vastly distributed. You also see Temu, international competition. So we are not in late stage capitalism, but proponents of late stage capitalism would argue that the gradual concentration of markets, like you see how Amazon is taking up the majority share of that market, in a capitalist society will result in monopolization of all markets. Although, and it is very important to note, in the United States, we are nowhere near late stage capitalism. And we do not have laissez faire capitalism. We have a mixed economy. We are right in the middle with a foundation of capitalism. So, communism, the big scare word that we all talk about. This ideology is present first in Marxist text. Karl Marx, when he writes the Communist Manifesto and Das Kapital. Communism we define as a complete absence of money and private ownership. And it is important to identify that as a complete absence of money and private ownership. A quick discussion regarding Karl Marx's work on communism is that in his text, he does not view communism as a system of government in which we necessarily need to advocate for within our independent sovereign states. He instead predicts a global revolution in which workers, the proletariat, would overthrow the bourgeoisie in his text. The workers are the proletariat, the bourgeoisie are those that own the capital, the wealthy, the lower classes. There will be such an inequality of in the distribution of wealth that the lower classes will be so fed up with this economic system that they will overthrow the bourgeoisie class. And he talks about 6 stages of society that that help you illustrate this progression. The last 2 stages are socialism and what is referred to as global stateless communism. Global stateless communism, in which we would have such a perfect redistribution of goods that all of us would have such equal ownership, we basically lose ownership and we lose the state authority because we no longer need a state authority and we kind of go back to a state of nature. Now, communism is not present anywhere in the world at the time other than in small scale collectives within Israel. These collectives are referred to as kibbutz. This is the one example we will see the most pure form of communism that has ever existed in human history. So again, another concept. I would love to have a detailed discussion with you via Zoom, email, whatever you desire. It is important to understand these concepts as concepts and understand them deeply through their origins, what they entail, and their applications. So I'm opening myself up to a discussion regarding these concepts at any time with anybody in any context. So please reach out. This will not be a quiz question in this upcoming quiz, although I think it is important to get a foundational definition provided to all of us as we maintain our discussions later on in this course. Communism is in no way present in the United States. Now, socialism. Socialism, we define it as the equal share of profit and property among all citizens. Karl Marx viewed socialism as the required step that would occur before communism. This is where the workers of the world would overthrow their systems of government, overthrow the bourgeoisie, and then they themselves, the proletariat governments, would then redistribute goods equally. And that is where we would have socialism. This is where goods and resources are equally divided among all citizens. Do we have private ownership in a socialist society? Yes, we do. We just have the role of the government is to redistribute that ownership as equally as possible. This is the imperfect implementation of collectivist principles. We see many socialist policies exist in modern capitalist states. This is where you would see a mixed economy. For example, welfare is a redistributive policy. Socialism is when all policies are equally redistributed perfectly. We do not have anywhere near socialism, but we have these traits within our mixed economy. Again, I am not going to quiz you on these terms, but it is important to depoliticize these terminologies, understand them as economic theories. And again, I will dive into this in much more detail with you independently if you desire. I do not want to make this a primary focus in this course, but I do think it is important to understand these three contrasting definitions between capitalism, communism, and socialism, and then understand that the United States is a mixed economy between socialism and capitalism in oversimplified terms. So you will not be quizzed on these last three terms. Although, you do have to remember everything else we covered in today's lecture. So be able to answer the questions, or what are the three contributions John Locke made to early American government? What is the state of nature, and what's John Locke's view on it? It is a somewhat optimistic view on the state of nature, and the state of nature is the state of society before any government. We also want to make sure we look at social contract theory. We understand that social contract theory is an exchange of certain rights for the protection of others, and this is what takes us out of the state of nature, and this is what is happening. We are going through the social contract theory when we create the state. And now it is very important to understand the clear and concrete definitions of the terms tyranny, anarchy, liberty, populism, nationalism, liberalism, conservatism, and libertarianism. These terms, these 8 terms, have one concrete definition for each of them. Remember that first lecture we did in this course where we talked about the nuance of definitions? These terms, we are all unifying in our definition we are going to rely on. And if we do not use the definition provided in today's lecture, we will, in every opportunity, present the definition we rely on and make sure that we find common ground and we understand objectively what these terms mean. So, again, here are your answers for the What Did We Learn slide, and I want to have a discussion about what is due this week. This week we have our first quiz due. Also need to follow up on our previous discussion and keep reading your readings. So, in overview of what's going on in the course right now, we know the What Did We Learn slides are every question on every quiz will come from the What Did We Learn slides. We will also have a discussion contribution every single week, excluding the last week when I give you some time to finish your essay and prepare for your final. So this discussion this week is a little simplified. It's a follow-up, so you have to respond to one of your classmates' comments on your original post. I will make sure that everybody has a response, so if you do not have a response by Tuesday, just give it another day. I will get to responding to everybody. I should be able to get to it by tomorrow. But if you have any questions about what to expect on the quiz, the closed note quiz, please reach out and I'm happy to help you. Make sure that if you have any concerns or questions about this class, you reach out because it is simpler than it may seem. Everything you need in any given week is in the contents tab for that week. If you want more detailed understandings of what's expected, how to succeed on the discussions, details about upcoming assignments, please look in the Guide to Success. It should be right above week 1. I think it's titled Introduction and Guide to Success. That has additional documents to help you understand the course generally, but you don't need to visit it. Everything you need in any given week is in that week's contents tab. Please reach out with any questions or concerns. I am not trying to stump you on these questions, on these assignments. I'm trying to help you understand this deeply and find a common ground in which we can engage with these concepts. We're laying down the foundation we're going to rely on for the rest of this course in this week's lecture and the weeks we've covered prior. And really starting next week or the week after, we're going to dive into detail on our branches of government, the responsibility of various offices that we have the power to elect and can even run for ourselves. So please reach out with any questions. If you want to yell at me about what I've said in today's lecture or any lecture prior, please do it. Email me, yell at me. Let's have a discussion. All right, y'all. Thank you. Have a good week. and I'll talk to y'all soon.